Desperation coursed through Grace Nelson's veins as she tucked her sleeping 4-year-old daughter into the small cot at the back of the dilapidated boarding house room they called home. Her calloused fingers trembled as she brushed a stray blonde curl from little Emma's forehead, the child's peaceful expression a stark contrast to the turmoil raging inside Grace. In Willits, Colorado, 1876, a widow with a child had precious few options for survival, and tonight, Grace had exhausted her last one. The unforgiving winter wind whistled through the cracks in the wall as Grace applied a thin layer of rouge to her pale cheeks. The mining town of Willits had boomed and busted within 3 years, leaving behind desperate men and even more desperate women. Since her husband Thomas had died in a mine collapse 11 months ago, Grace had taken in laundry, mended clothing, and cleaned houses to keep food in Emma's mouth. But the harsh winter had frozen most opportunities, and their landlord's patience had run out. Just tonight, she whispered to herself, tears threatening to spill from her emerald eyes. Just enough to pay the rent and buy food for another week. The Golden Palace Saloon stood at the end of the muddy Main Street, its glow a beacon in the darkness. Inside, the scent of cheap whiskey, sweat, and perfume hung heavy in the air. Grace swallowed hard, clutching her threadbare shawl closer to her body as she approached the bar. Madame Lucille, the establishment's shrewd proprietress, eyed Grace with a mixture of pity and calculation. "Well, well, never thought I'd see the preacher's daughter darken my doorway." "I need money," Grace said, her voice barely audible over the out-of-tune piano. "Mrs. Calloway is watching Emma tonight, but I have to pay the rent tomorrow or we'll be on the street." Lucille blew out a stream of smoke. "You know what kind of work I can offer. Just for tonight," Grace insisted, hating the desperation in her voice. The madam nodded toward the staircase. "Second door on the right. Clean yourself up. When you come down, sit at that table by the window. I'll send interested parties your way." 30 minutes later, Grace sat rigidly at the designated table, her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd washed her face, pinned up her auburn hair, and borrowed a low-cut dress from one of Lucille's girls. Every man's glance felt like a physical touch, making her skin crawl beneath the garish fabric. The saloon doors swung open, bringing with them a gust of cold air and a tall figure silhouetted against the night. The crowd parted slightly as the newcomer moved toward the bar, his spurs jingling with each deliberate step. Grace kept her eyes lowered, but she could feel a shift in the room's energy. "Whiskey," a deep voice commanded, its timbre carrying easily over the noise. Curious despite herself, Grace glanced up. The man stood with his back to her, but even from behind, she could tell he wasn't a local miner or shopkeeper. His broad shoulders were draped in a long duster coat, dusted with snow, and a black Stetson sat atop dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. A worn leather gun belt hung low on his hips, the holster holding what looked like a well-maintained Colt. "Kade Sullivan," the barkeep greeted him with a nod of recognition. "Didn't expect to see you back in Willits." "Just passing through," the man Kade replied, lifting the glass of amber liquid to his lips. Grace quickly averted her eyes when he began to turn, but not quickly enough. She felt rather than saw him studying her from across the room. Heat crawled up her neck as she pretended to be fascinated by the small candle flickering on her table. "Newcomer," she heard Kade ask the barkeep. The bartender's voice dropped, but in the momentary lull of piano music, his words carried. "Widow Nelson. Husband died in the mine collapse last spring. First night working for Lucille." Grace's cheeks burned with humiliation. She wanted to flee, but where would she go? What would happen to Emma if she returned empty-handed? Heavy footsteps approached her table. A shadow fell across the scarred wood. Grace forced herself to look up, meeting a pair of intensely blue eyes set in a weathered face. Up close, she could see that Kade Sullivan was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30, but with the hard-earned lines of a man who'd seen his share of difficult times. "Madam," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Mind if I join you?" Grace's throat tightened. This was it. The moment she crossed a line she'd never imagined crossing. "Please," she managed, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. Instead of sitting immediately, Kade glanced around the room, taking note of the other men watching with interest. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly before he pulled out the chair and lowered himself into it. "I'm Kade Sullivan," he said, setting his whiskey on the table. "Grace Nelson," she replied, the words barely audible. He studied her face for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You don't want to be here." It wasn't a question. Grace's eyes stung with the threat of tears. "Does it matter what I want?" "It should," he said simply. Then, leaning forward, "Why are you here, Mrs. Nelson?" The unexpected question, asked not with judgment but with genuine curiosity, broke something inside her. "My daughter," she whispered. "Emma, she's 4, will be evicted tomorrow if I can't pay the rent. I've tried everything else." Kade's gaze never left her face. "Everything?" "Yes," Grace said, a flash of indignation cutting through her shame. "I've taken in laundry until my hands bled. I've cleaned houses, mended clothing, sold everything of value we owned. I even tried to find work at the telegraph office, but Mr. Porter said a woman would be a distraction." She looked down at her borrowed dress. "So here I am." The silence between them stretched, broken only by the resumption of the tinny piano and raucous laughter from a nearby poker game. "How much?" Kade finally asked, his voice low. Grace named the sum that would cover their rent and food for a week. She hated herself for the relief she felt when he nodded, as though her price was reasonable. To her surprise, Kade stood and extended his hand. "Come with me." Grace hesitated, uncertainty making her heart race. Where was he taking her? One of the rooms upstairs, or somewhere else entirely, but she had no choice. She placed her trembling hand in his much larger one and allowed him to lead her toward the bar. "Lucille," he called, and the madam sauntered over, arching an eyebrow at Grace's hand in his. "Mr. Sullivan, I see you've made your selection for the evening." "Not exactly," Kade replied, reaching into his coat. He withdrew a leather pouch that clinked with the unmistakable sound of coins. "I'd like to settle Mrs. Nelson's arrangement with you." Lucille's painted lips curved into a knowing smile. "That'll be double whatever you were planning to charge her," Kade interrupted, dropping the pouch on the bar. "And she's free to go." Grace stared at him in disbelief. Lucille counted the coins with practiced fingers, her expression shifting from surprise to satisfaction. "Well, well," the madam said, pocketing the money. "Seems like your luck's turned, Grace. You're free to go and don't feel obliged to return." Her eyes slid to Kade. "Unless you're looking for other employment, Sullivan. I could use a man who handles himself like you do." "Much obliged for the offer, madam, but I've got other plans," Kade replied evenly. He turned to Grace. "Shall we?" Too stunned to speak, Grace allowed him to guide her toward the door. The cold night air slapped her face as they stepped outside, bringing her back to her senses. "I don't understand," she said, stopping on the boardwalk. "What do you want from me?" Kade's expression softened slightly in the glow of the saloon lights. "Nothing you're thinking, Mrs. Nelson. I just couldn't stand by and watch a decent woman forced into that life. But the money, I can spare it." He shrugged off her concern. "Where are you staying? I'll walk you home." Grace hesitated. "The boarding house on Pine Street, but my daughter is with Mrs. Calloway, you said." "We can collect her on the way." The walk through town was silent, Grace's mind whirling with confusion and relief. When they reached the Calloway home, the older woman opened the door with a sleeping Emma already bundled in her arms. Her eyes widened at the sight of Kade standing behind Grace. "Everything all right, Grace?" Mrs. Calloway asked cautiously. "Yes," Grace assured her, taking her daughter. "Thank you for watching Emma. Mr. Sullivan is a friend. He's escorting us home." Mrs. Calloway didn't look convinced, but she nodded and closed the door after one last suspicious glance at Kade. As they continued toward the boarding house, Emma stirred against Grace's shoulder, blinking sleepily. "Mama!" "I'm here, sweetheart," Grace soothed. "Go back to sleep." Emma's curious eyes found Kade walking beside them. "Who's that?" Before Grace could answer, Kade tipped his hat to the child. "Kade Sullivan, at your service, Miss Emma." The little girl smiled shyly before nestling back against her mother's neck. Grace felt a tightness in her chest that had nothing to do with the cold. At the boarding house steps, Grace finally found her voice again. "I don't know how to thank you, Mr. Sullivan." "No need for thanks," he replied. He reached into his pocket and withdrew several more coins, holding them out to her. "This should help with food and necessities for a while." Grace stared at the money, pride warring with practicality. "I can't accept that." "You can," he insisted, "for Emma's sake." At the mention of her daughter, Grace reluctantly took the money. "I'll pay you back, somehow." Kade studied her for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "I might have a proposition for you, Mrs. Nelson." "Not that kind," he added quickly, seeing her face. "A legitimate offer." "But it's late, and you need to get your little one to bed. May I call on you tomorrow morning?" Grace hesitated only briefly before nodding. "We'll be here." With a tip of his hat, Kade turned and walked back toward the main street, his figure soon swallowed by the darkness. Grace stood watching long after he disappeared, the money clutched tightly in her hand, wondering what kind of proposition a man like Kade Sullivan could possibly have for a woman like her. The next morning dawned bright and cold, the sun glinting off fresh snow. Grace had spent a restless night alternating between gratitude for her unlikely savior and anxiety about his mysterious proposition. Emma, oblivious to her mother's worries, happily played with her rag doll while Grace swept their small room and put fresh water in the basin. A knock at the door came precisely at 9 o'clock. Grace smoothed her simple cotton dress, the only decent one she still owned, and opened the door to find Kade Sullivan standing in the hallway, hat in hand. In the daylight, she could see him more clearly, the fine lines around his eyes that crinkled when he offered a slight smile, the shadow of stubble on his strong jaw, the way his dark hair curled slightly where it met his collar. "Good morning, Mrs. Nelson," he said, his deep voice quieter than it had been in the saloon. "Mr. Sullivan," she acknowledged, stepping back to allow him entry. "Please come in." He ducked his tall frame through the doorway, his eyes taking in the sparse furnishings of their single room. The small iron stove in the corner provided the only heat, and their few possessions were neatly arranged to make the space appear less barren. If he was shocked by their poverty, he didn't show it. Emma peeked out from behind Grace's skirts, regarding their visitor with undisguised curiosity. "Hello again, Miss Emma," Kade said, crouching down to her level. From his pocket he produced a small wooden horse, its surface smooth with simple, elegant carving. "I thought you might like this." The little girl's eyes widened with delight as she reached for the toy. "Thank you," she exclaimed, immediately prancing the horse across the floor. Grace watched the interaction with surprise. "That was very kind, Mr. Sullivan." He straightened, a faint flush coloring his tanned cheeks. "It's nothing. I whittle a bit when I'm on the trail, helps pass the time." She gestured to the small table with its two mismatched chairs. "Would you like some coffee? It's not very good, I'm afraid." "That would be welcome," he said, taking a seat that seemed too small for his frame. Grace busied herself with pouring coffee into a chipped cup, grateful for the moment to collect her thoughts. When she sat across from him, she found those intense blue eyes studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You mentioned a proposition," she said, deciding directness was best. Kade nodded, wrapping his large hands around the cup. "I did. I've been riding for a few years now, working cattle drives, doing some scouting, occasional bounty hunting when money was tight. But I recently came into some property, a ranch about 15 miles west of here. It's nothing grand, but there's a decent house, a barn, good grazing land, and a creek that doesn't dry up." He paused, taking a sip of coffee. "The problem is, a ranch needs tending. I can handle the stock and the land well enough, but the house—" He trailed off, looking uncomfortable. Grace waited, confusion creasing her brow. "Are you offering me a position as your housekeeper?" "No," he said quickly. Then, with a deep breath, "I'm offering you marriage." The coffee cup slipped from Grace's fingers, clattering onto the table and spilling its contents. She barely noticed as she stared at him in shock. "Marriage," she echoed. "But you don't even know me." Kade remained calm, using a handkerchief from his pocket to mop up the spilled coffee. "I know you're a devoted mother who was willing to sacrifice everything for your child. I know you've worked hard and honestly until circumstances forced you into an impossible situation. That tells me more about your character than knowing your favorite color or what books you like to read." Grace opened her mouth, then closed it again, utterly at a loss for words. "It would be a practical arrangement," he continued, his voice matter of fact. "You and Emma would have a home, a real home with land around it, not just a room. You'd never have to worry about rent or where your next meal is coming from. Emma could grow up with fresh air and space to run." He gestured toward the child, who was still happily playing with the wooden horse. "And I'd have someone to make the ranch a home, to cook meals and keep things in order while I work the land and cattle." "A marriage of convenience," Grace said slowly. Kade nodded. "Yes, though I would expect us to be husband and wife in all respects eventually." His eyes met hers directly. "I wouldn't force anything, but I do want children of my own someday." Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks at his bluntness. "Mr. Sullivan, Kade," he corrected. "Kade," she amended. "This is unexpected. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to answer right away," he said. "Take some time to think about it. But I'll be honest with you, I don't plan to stay in town more than a couple of days. I need to get back to the ranch." Grace glanced at Emma, who had abandoned her play to listen to their conversation with the keen interest of a child who knows adults are discussing something important. "What about Emma?" Grace asked quietly. How would you feel about her?" Kade's expression softened as he looked at the little girl. "I'd treat her as my own," he said simply. "She'd carry my name, have everything I could provide. I'd never try to replace her father's memory, but I'd be a father to her in every way that matters." Grace felt tears prick her eyes at his words. Since Thomas's death, she'd worried constantly about Emma growing up without a father's guidance and protection. "May I think about it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of course." Kade stood, placing his hat back on his head. "I'm staying at the hotel down the street, room 3. When you've made your decision, whatever it is, you can find me there." He moved toward the door, then paused. "I'll understand if your answer is no, Mrs. Nelson, but I hope it won't be." After he left, Grace sank back into her chair, mind spinning. Emma climbed into her lap, the wooden horse clutched in her small hand. "Mama, is that man going to be my new papa?" she asked, her innocent question cutting straight to the heart of the matter. Grace stroked her daughter's blonde curls. "Would you like that, Emma?" The child considered this seriously. "He makes nice horses," she said finally, And he has kind eyes like Papa did. Out of the mouths of babes, Grace thought. Emma was right. Despite his intimidating appearance, Kade Sullivan did have kind eyes, but was kindness enough to build a marriage on? Throughout the day, Grace pondered Cade's offer as she went about her tasks. She took their rent money to the surly landlord, who seemed disappointed that she'd managed to pay. She purchased a small amount of food with some of Cade's coins, carefully saving the rest. She darned socks and mended a tear in Emma's only warm dress. All the while, her mind wrestled with the decision before her. Marriage to a virtual stranger seemed reckless, potentially dangerous. What did she really know about Kade Sullivan? He could be cruel behind closed doors. He could tire of them and cast them out. He could die like Thomas, leaving her in the same precarious position. But the alternative was continued poverty in Willits, always one misfortune away from the situation she'd found herself in last night. How long before she'd be forced to enter Madame Lucille's employment permanently? What kind of future would that give Emma? As evening approached, Grace made her decision. After settling Emma with Mrs. Calloway once more, she walked the short distance to the hotel, her heart hammering in her chest. The desk clerk directed her to room 3 with a knowing look that made her flush, but she held her head high as she climbed the stairs. Kade answered her soft knock immediately, as though he'd been waiting. He'd removed his coat and gun belt, and his shirt sleeves were rolled up to reveal strong forearms. "Mrs. Nelson," he said, stepping back to allow her inside. "Please come in." The hotel room was plain but clean, with a bed, a small desk, and a chair. Kade gestured for her to take the chair while he sat on the edge of the bed. "I've made my decision," Grace said, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I'll marry you, Mr. Sullivan Kade, but I have conditions." If he was surprised by her businesslike approach, he didn't show it. "I'm listening." "First, I want your promise that you'll always be kind to Emma and treat her as your own child." "You have it," he said without hesitation. "Second, I want to know that if something happens to you, the ranch or some portion of its value would go to me and Emma, so we wouldn't be left with nothing." Kade nodded slowly. "That's fair. We'll visit the lawyer before we leave town and have papers drawn up." Grace took a deep breath. "Third, I need time, before we become husband and wife in all ways." A slight smile touched his lips. "I already promised I wouldn't force anything. We can share a home without sharing a bed until you're ready." "And if I'm never ready?" she challenged, needing to understand the limits of his patience. His eyes held hers steadily. "Then that's how it will be. But I think, in time, you might see that there can be comfort and even joy in a marriage that began as a practical arrangement." Grace hadn't expected such a thoughtful answer. "There's one more thing," she said quietly. "What's that?" "I want to know why." "Why me?" "You could find a younger woman, someone without a child, someone who might care for you from the beginning." Kade was silent for a long moment, his gaze dropping to his hands. "I'm 32 years old, Mrs. Nelson. I've spent most of my adult life moving from place to place, taking whatever work came my way. I've known women, but never the kind a man builds a life with." He looked up at her. "When I saw you in that saloon trying to be brave while your heart was breaking, something in me recognized something in you. We're both survivors. We both know what it means to do what needs doing, no matter how hard." He leaned forward, his expression earnest. "I don't expect love, at least not right away. But I do believe we could build something good together, something real. And maybe, in time, affection would grow." Grace was surprised by the emotion in his voice, the sincerity in his eyes. For the first time, she allowed herself to really look at him not just as a mysterious benefactor or a potential protector, but as a man. A man with his own hopes and hurts, his own needs and dreams. "When would we marry?" she asked, her decision solidifying. "Tomorrow, if you're willing. The preacher can perform the ceremony, and we can leave for the ranch the following morning." "So soon," Grace murmured. "Winter's setting in," Kade explained. "I'd rather get you and Emma settled before the worst of it hits. The trail can be difficult when the snow is deep." Grace nodded her understanding. "Very well, tomorrow it is." Kade stood and offered his hand. When she placed hers in it, he surprised her by bringing it to his lips for a brief, gentle kiss. "Thank you, Grace," he said, using her given name for the first time. "I'll do my best to be a good husband to you and a good father to Emma." "And I'll try to be a good wife," she replied, meaning it despite the butterflies in her stomach. She left his room with her mind made up but her emotions in turmoil. In 24 hours, she would become Mrs. Kade Sullivan, a rancher's wife, no longer a desperate widow on the edge of ruin. It wasn't the future she'd imagined for herself, but as she walked back to collect Emma, she found herself hoping it might be a good one nonetheless. The morning of her wedding dawned clear and cold. Grace dressed Emma in her best clothes, a dress that was too small but at least clean and mended, and put on her own Sunday dress, a simple blue cotton that had faded with washings but still maintained its shape. She had no veil, no flowers, no family to witness the ceremony. Just a small box containing her first wedding ring, which she'd removed last night with a whispered apology to Thomas's memory. Mrs. Calloway helped pin Grace's auburn hair into a neat arrangement. "You sure about this, girl?" the older woman asked, her eyes concerned in the small mirror. "Marrying a man you barely know? No," Grace admitted, "but I'm sure it's better than the alternatives." "He seems decent enough," Mrs. Calloway conceded. "And Lord knows you've had it rough since Thomas passed. I just hope this Sullivan fellow treats you and little Emma right." "So do I," Grace said softly. Kade was waiting for them at the small Methodist church on the edge of town. He'd cleaned up considerably, wearing a new-looking shirt under a dark vest and coat, his hair neatly combed, his face freshly shaved. Next to him stood a man Grace recognized as Mr. Garrett, the town's only lawyer. "You look beautiful," Kade said when she approached, his eyes warm with admiration. Grace felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "Thank you." The ceremony was brief and straightforward. Reverend Wilson, who had buried Thomas less than a year ago, performed the service with a mixture of concern and hope in his voice. Emma stood solemnly at her mother's side, occasionally peering up at Kade with curiosity. When it came time for the rings, Kade produced a simple gold band that he slid onto Grace's finger next to the worn one from Thomas that she had decided to continue wearing. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the Reverend said. "You may kiss your bride." Grace tensed, suddenly uncertain. Kade seemed to sense her discomfort. He leaned down and placed a chaste kiss on her cheek instead of her lips, his hand giving hers a reassuring squeeze. Afterward, Mr. Garrett had them sign the papers. Kade had promised documents ensuring that if Kade died, the ranch would belong to Grace and Emma. There was also a formal adoption paper for Emma, legally making her Kade's daughter as well as Grace's child. "I'd be proud if she took my name," Kade said, looking at the little girl who was exploring the lawyer's office with wide-eyed interest. "But if you'd rather she keep Nelson in memory of her father, I understand." Grace was touched by his sensitivity. "Emma Nelson Sullivan," she decided. "So she carries both her fathers with her." Kade's expression softened with something that looked almost like tenderness. "Thank you." That night, after a modest wedding supper at the hotel dining room, Kade escorted his new family to his hotel room. He'd arranged for a cot to be brought in for Emma, who was exhausted from the day's excitement. An awkward silence fell once the child was asleep. Grace stood by the window, acutely aware of Kade moving around the room, removing his boots and coat. "I'll sleep in the chair," he said, breaking the tension. "You take the bed." Grace turned to protest. "But I've slept in worse places," he assured her with a small smile. "Trust me. Trust. Such a simple word for such a complex concept." Grace realized that was exactly what she was trying to do, to trust this man who had rescued her from degradation and offered her respectability, security, and possibly, eventually, happiness. "Thank you," she said, the words inadequate for the depth of her gratitude. Kade merely nodded, settling his large frame into the wooden chair and tipping his hat over his eyes. Grace slipped into the bed, still fully clothed except for her shoes, and pulled the blanket up to her chin. Despite her exhaustion, sleep was long in coming. They left Willits the following morning in a wagon Kade had purchased. Their few belongings fit easily in the back, along with supplies he'd bought for the journey and for their new life at the ranch. Emma, excited by the adventure, bounced on the seat between them as they rode out of town. Grace looked back once at the collection of wooden buildings that had been her home for the past 3 years. She'd come to Willits as a young bride, hopeful and in love. She was leaving as a widow, embarking on a marriage of convenience to a man who was still largely a mystery to her. Life, she reflected, had a way of taking unexpected turns. The journey to the ranch took most of the day. As they traveled, Kade pointed out landmarks and told them about the area. He'd bought the property from a retiring rancher who'd lost his wife to illness and decided to move east to live with his daughter's family. "It's good land," Kade said, his eyes scanning the rolling hills that were dusted with early snow. "The previous owner, Mr. Harrington, ran about 60 head of cattle. I'm starting smaller, just 20 for now, but there's room to grow if things go well." "Have you always wanted to be a rancher?" Grace asked, genuinely curious about the man who was now her husband. Kade considered this. "Not always. My pa had a small farm in Missouri, but it wasn't enough to support all of us kids. I left home at 16, drifted west, did whatever work I could find." His expression turned thoughtful. "But I always liked the idea of having my own place someday. Land that's yours changes a man. Gives him roots, purpose." "How did you afford to buy a ranch?" Grace asked before she could stop herself. "I'm sorry that's too personal." "No, it's a fair question," Kade replied. "I did some bounty hunting for a few years, saved most of what I earned. Then last year, I helped a wealthy rancher near Denver track down some men who'd stolen his prize bulls. He was generous with the reward." Grace digested this information. "You were a bounty hunter?" Kade glanced at her, perhaps detecting the note of unease in her voice. "I only went after men with prices on their heads for good reason: murderers, robbers, men who hurt women and children. Never shot a man who wasn't trying to shoot me first." His answer should have reassured her, but Grace found herself wondering how many men Kade Sullivan had killed in his 32 years. She reminded herself that the West was a harsh place, and sometimes survival required harsh actions. After all, hadn't she herself nearly stepped into a life she'd once considered unthinkable? They crested a small rise in the late afternoon, and Kade pulled the wagon to a stop. "There it is," he said, nodding toward the valley below. "Sullivan Ranch." Grace followed his gaze. Nestled against a backdrop of pine-covered hills stood a log house with a covered porch wrapping around 2 sides. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, suggesting someone was there. Nearby stood a large barn, a corral, and several smaller outbuildings. A creek wound through the property, its banks lined with cottonwoods that had shed their leaves for winter. "Who's there?" Grace asked, noticing the smoke. "Mrs. Redmond," Kade explained. "The widow of one of Mr. Harrington's ranch hands. She's been looking after the place until I returned." She lives in a small cabin just beyond the barn with her son, who helps with the cattle. As they approached, Grace could see that the house was larger than it had appeared from a distance. 2 stories, solidly built, with glass windows and a proper roof. Compared to their room in the boarding house, it seemed almost palatial. A plump, gray-haired woman emerged from the front door as they pulled up, wiping her hands on an apron. Behind her, a young man of perhaps 20 stepped out, nodding at Kade. "Mr. Sullivan, we weren't expecting you back so soon," the woman called. "Mrs. Redmond," Kade greeted her, jumping down from the wagon and coming around to help Grace and Emma descend. "I'd like you to meet my wife, Grace, and my daughter, Emma." Grace noted the surprise that flashed across Mrs. Redmond's face, quickly masked by a welcoming smile. "Well, bless my soul, a wife and child, come in, I've got stew on the stove and fresh bread in the oven." She ushered them into a large, warm kitchen that smelled of cooking food and wood smoke. Emma, shy at first, soon warmed to the motherly woman who slipped her a cookie and showed her a kitten that had taken up residence in a basket by the hearth, while Mrs. Redmond's son, Daniel, helped Kade unload the wagon. The older woman gave Grace a tour of the house. There were 4 bedrooms upstairs, a parlor, the kitchen with its big table, and a small study on the first floor. The furniture was simple but solid, much of it built by the previous owner. "Mr. Harrington built this place for his bride 30 years ago," Mrs. Redmond explained as they climbed the stairs. "Added on as their family grew. His wife loved beauty, so he put in these glass windows instead of oil paper like most folks use. Cost him a pretty penny to have them hauled all the way from Denver." Grace ran her fingers along the smooth wooden banister. "It's a lovely home." Mrs. Redmond showed her the main bedroom with its big 4-poster bed, a smaller room that would be perfect for Emma, and 2 additional bedrooms that stood empty for now. "I've kept the place as clean as I could," the older woman said, "but it needs a woman's touch. Mr. Sullivan's been here nearly 2 months, but he's been so busy with the cattle and repairs to the barn, he's hardly touched the house." When they returned downstairs, Kade and Daniel had finished unloading the wagon. Emma had fallen asleep on a small sofa in the parlor, exhausted from the journey and excitement. "We should be going," Mrs. Redmond said, gathering her shawl. "Let you folks get settled. I've left stew and bread for your supper, and there are eggs and milk in the springhouse. Daniel and I will be back tomorrow to help with whatever needs doing." After they left, a strange silence fell over the house. Grace stood in the middle of the kitchen, suddenly overwhelmed by the reality of her new situation. She was mistress of this house, wife to the man standing awkwardly by the doorway, mother to the sleeping child in the next room. "Are you hungry?" she asked, grasping for normalcy. "Starving," Kade admitted with a small smile. They ate Mrs. Redmond's excellent stew at the kitchen table, making careful conversation about the ranch and what needed to be done. Kade explained the seasonal rhythms of cattle ranching, and Grace shared her ideas for a vegetable garden when spring came. The awkwardness between them eased somewhat as they discovered shared practical values and work ethics. After supper, Kade carried the still sleeping Emma upstairs to the room that would be hers. Grace followed with their small bag of belongings, watching as he gently laid the child on the bed. Together, they removed Emma's shoes and covered her with a quilt. "She's a beautiful child," Kade said softly as they stood looking down at her. "You've done well with her despite the hardships." "She's been my strength," Grace replied. "On the days when I wanted to give up, Emma needed me to keep going." They stepped out into the hallway, and Grace felt the tension return. The main bedroom with its large bed loomed at the end of the corridor. Kade seemed to sense her discomfort. "I'll sleep in one of the other bedrooms," he said quietly. As I promised, Grace, nothing happens until you're ready. Relief and something like disappointment mingled in Grace's chest. Thank you, she said, not meeting his eyes. Good night, then, he said, taking a step toward one of the empty rooms. Then he paused, turning back to her. I know this isn't the marriage you dreamed of, but I meant what I said in town. I'll try to be a good husband to you. I hope in time you'll be glad you made this choice. Before she could respond, he continued down the hallway, leaving Grace standing alone outside her daughter's room, wondering if she'd made the right decision or the biggest mistake of her life. The first weeks at Sullivan Ranch passed in a blur of adjustment and activity. Grace threw herself into making the house truly livable, scrubbing floors, washing curtains, organizing the kitchen to her liking. Emma quickly lost her shyness and took to following Kade around whenever he worked near the house, peppering him with questions that he answered with surprising patience. Mrs. Redmond came by several times a week, helping Grace learn the routines of ranch life and teaching her to make butter from the milk of their 2 cows. Daniel Redmond worked for Kade full-time, and occasionally other men from nearby ranches would ride in to help with larger tasks. Grace and Kade settled into a routine of polite coexistence. They shared meals, discussed the running of the ranch, and worked side by side when necessary, but there remained a careful distance between them. Each night, they retired to separate bedrooms, though Grace sometimes lay awake wondering about the man sleeping down the hall, a husband who was not truly her husband yet. December arrived with heavy snow that blanketed the ranch in white silence. The cattle huddled in the sheltered areas Kade had prepared for them, and the daily work shifted to maintenance and indoor tasks. In the evenings, Kade would sit by the fire in the parlor, whittling small toys for Emma, or reading one of the books from the small collection left by the previous owners. One such evening, with Emma already in bed, Grace worked on mending by the fire while Kade read. The comfortable silence between them was broken only by the crackling of the flames and the occasional turn of a page. Grace found her eyes drawn to his profile, the strong jaw, the slight furrow of concentration between his brows, the way his long fingers handled the book with surprising gentleness. "You enjoy reading?" she asked, surprising herself by initiating conversation beyond the practical matters they usually discussed. Kade looked up, as though equally surprised by her question. "I do. My mother taught me before she passed. Reading was her great joy, and she passed that on to me." "How old were you when she died?" Grace asked, setting aside her mending. 12, he replied. "Influenza took her and my youngest sister in the same week." "I'm sorry," Grace said softly. "My parents are both gone as well. My father was a preacher in St. Louis. He died when I was 16. My mother followed 2 years later." "Is that when you came west?" Grace nodded. "I was working as a school teacher when I met Thomas. He had such dreams of making his fortune in the gold and silver mines. We married after a short courtship and headed for Colorado." She smiled sadly at the memory of her first husband's enthusiasm. "He was a good man, kind and hardworking, just not very lucky." Kade set his book aside. "How did you meet him?" "He came to a church social where I was helping serve refreshments. Spilled lemonade all over my best dress, then spent the next week bringing me wildflowers to apologize." The memory brought a genuine smile to her face. "He was so earnest, so determined to make me forgive him, though I'd done so immediately. By the time the wildflowers stopped, I was half in love with him already." "You loved him very much," Kade observed, no jealousy in his voice, only understanding. "I did," Grace acknowledged. "We had barely 3 years together before the mine collapse, not nearly enough time." She looked at Kade curiously. "Have you ever been in love?" A shadow crossed his features. Once, a long time ago, something in his tone made Grace hesitate to press further, but her curiosity won out. What happened? Kade stared into the fire for a long moment before answering. Her name was Sarah. Her father owned the general store in the town where I first worked as a ranch hand. I was 19, she was 17. We had plans to marry once I saved enough for a place of our own. His jaw tightened. Then a group of outlaws rode through town. There was a robbery, shots fired. Sarah was hit by a stray bullet while helping a child get to safety. "Oh, Kade," Grace whispered, horrified. "I'm so sorry." After that, I couldn't stay there, the memories. He shook his head. That's when I started drifting, took whatever work came my way. Eventually fell into bounty hunting, partly for the money, partly because I wanted to make sure men who brought violence to innocent people faced justice. Grace saw him in a new light. His quiet strength, his self-containment, these weren't just personality traits, but protective layers built over deep wounds. "Is that why you helped me that night at the saloon?" she asked softly. "Because you couldn't help Sarah?" Kade looked up, his blue eyes intense. "Maybe partly. But mostly because when I saw you sitting there, looking so out of place and yet so determined to do whatever it took to protect your child, I admired your courage, and I couldn't bear to see it cost you your dignity." The honesty in his voice touched something in Grace's heart. For the first time, she saw not just the practical benefits of their arrangement, but the possibility that this man might truly come to care for her, might already care in his own way. "Thank you for telling me," she said, reaching across the space between their chairs to touch his hand briefly. Kade's fingers turned, capturing hers for a moment before releasing them. "It's getting late," he said, standing. "I should check on the animals before turning in." He pulled on his coat and stepped out into the snowy night, leaving Grace to ponder the new understanding that had emerged between them. That night, for the first time, she found herself wondering what it might be like to truly be Kade Sullivan's wife, not just in name, but in all ways. Christmas approached, bringing a festive spirit to the ranch despite the isolation imposed by winter weather. Grace was determined to make the holiday special for Emma, who had known little celebration the previous year after Thomas's death. Using skills from her teaching days, she helped Emma create paper decorations for the small pine tree Kade had cut and brought into the parlor. Mrs. Redmond contributed a fruit cake and taught Grace to make toffee using molasses and butter. Kade disappeared into his workshop in the barn for hours at a time, emerging with sawdust clinging to his clothes but refusing to reveal what he was making. On Christmas Eve, after Emma had hung her stocking by the fireplace and gone to bed buzzing with excitement, Grace and Kade sat together in the parlor. The room was lit only by firelight and the candles on the small tree, creating a warm, intimate atmosphere. "I have something for you," Kade said, reaching into his pocket. "I wanted to give it to you privately, before tomorrow's excitement." He handed her a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with a piece of red yarn. Grace unwrapped it carefully to reveal a wooden box, intricately carved with a pattern of wildflowers. "It's beautiful," she breathed, running her fingers over the detailed work. "Open it," he encouraged. Inside, nestled on a piece of soft cloth, lay a delicate silver locket on a fine chain. Grace lifted it with trembling fingers, touched beyond words by the unexpected gift. "It was my mother's," Kade explained. "One of the few things of hers I kept, I thought. Well, there's room inside for a small portrait, perhaps of Emma or both of you," Grace finished, looking up at him with shining eyes. "Thank you, Kade. I'll treasure it." She reached beneath the sofa and pulled out her own gift for him, a woolen scarf she had knitted in secret during the evenings after he'd gone to check on the animals. "It's not as fine as your gift," she said as he unwrapped it, "but the winters are cold here, and I noticed your old one was wearing thin." Cade ran the dark blue wool through his hands, a smile spreading across his face. "No one has made me something by hand since my mother. Thank you, Grace." Without thinking, she reached up to help him try it on, wrapping the scarf around his neck and adjusting it slightly. The gesture brought them physically closer than they had been since their wedding day. Grace became acutely aware of his warmth, the clean scent of soap and leather that clung to him, the way his breath quickened slightly as her fingers brushed against his neck. "There," she said softly, her hands resting lightly on his chest. "It suits you." Cade's eyes dropped to her lips, a question in them that made her heart race. Slowly, giving her time to pull away, he lowered his head. When his lips touched hers, the kiss was gentle, questioning, and brief, but it sent a shiver of awareness through Grace's entire body. He drew back slightly, studying her reaction. "I've been wanting to do that since the day I brought you here," he admitted, his voice low. Grace swallowed, emotions warring within her: guilt at responding to a man who wasn't Thomas, excitement at the new feeling stirring within her, uncertainty about whether she was ready for what might follow. "I should check on Emma," she said, taking a small step backward, though her body seemed reluctant to create distance between them. Cade nodded, no disappointment showing in his expression, only patience and understanding. "Of course. Good night, Grace. Merry Christmas." "Merry Christmas, Cade," she replied, her fingers touching her lips briefly as she left the room. Christmas Day brought joy and simple pleasures. Emma was delighted with the beautifully crafted doll's house Cade had made for her, complete with tiny furniture. Grace received a warm shawl from Mrs. Redmond, who joined them for Christmas dinner along with her son. The day passed in a glow of contentment that lingered even after their guests had departed. That night, after Emma had fallen asleep surrounded by her new treasures, Grace stood in the hallway between her bedroom and Cade's, gathering her courage. Their kiss the night before had awakened something in her, a longing not just for physical closeness, but for the true companionship of marriage. She knocked softly on his door. When he opened it, dressed only in his trousers and undershirt, the surprise was evident on his face. "Grace, is something wrong?" "No," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. I wanted to thank you for today, for making it so special for Emma. For all of us." "You don't need to thank me," he said. Having a family to share Christmas with was gift enough. The sincerity in his words gave her the courage to continue. "I've been thinking about what you said when you proposed this arrangement. About us becoming husband and wife in all ways eventually." She took a deep breath. "I think I'm ready for eventually to begin." Cade's eyes widened slightly, but he made no move toward her. "Are you certain? There's no rush, Grace. I meant what I said about waiting until you're ready." "I know you did," she said softly. "That's one of the reasons, I'm sure." She stepped forward, placing her hand on his chest as she had the night before. "I want to be your wife, Cade, not just in name but in truth." His hand came up to cover hers, warm and strong. "I don't want you to feel obligated," he said, searching her eyes. "This isn't part of our bargain. It's something that should happen only if you truly desire it." Grace smiled, touched by his concern. "I do desire it," she admitted, a blush coloring her cheeks. "I desire you." The declaration seemed to break something loose in Cade. He pulled her gently into his room and closed the door behind them. This time, when he kissed her, there was nothing hesitant about it. His arms encircled her waist, drawing her against the solid warmth of his body as his mouth moved over hers with growing passion. Grace responded with a fervor that surprised her, her hands sliding up to tangle in his dark hair as she opened to him. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily. "I've wanted you from the first moment I saw you," Kade confessed, his voice rough with emotion. "Not just your beauty, though God knows you're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen, but your spirit, your strength, your tenderness with Emma." He traced her cheek with his fingertips. "I didn't expect to find you, Grace. I thought I'd spend my life alone, but now that you're here, I can't imagine my world without you in it." Tears pricked Grace's eyes at his words. "I never thought I could feel this way again after Thomas died. I thought that part of me had died with him. But you've awakened something in me, Kade, something new and different, but just as real." He led her to the bed, where a single lamp cast a golden glow over the room. With infinite care, he began to undo the buttons of her dress, his eyes never leaving hers, always watching for any sign of reluctance or hesitation. But Grace felt only a growing certainty as each layer between them fell away. When at last they came together as husband and wife, Grace discovered that physical love could be a language all its own, a way of communicating things too profound for words. In Kade's arms, she found not just pleasure, but a sense of coming home, of finding a safe harbor after too long adrift on stormy seas. Afterward, as they lay tangled together beneath the quilts, Kade's strong arm around her waist and his breath warm against her neck, Grace knew their marriage had truly begun. Whatever had brought them together, be it chance, desperation, or providence, no longer mattered. What mattered was the life they would build together, day by day from this moment forward. "Sleep, my love," Kade murmured, pressing a kiss to her shoulder. "Tomorrow is a new day." And so it was the first day of their life as a true family. Winter gradually gave way to spring, and with the changing season came new growth both on the ranch and in Grace and Kade's relationship. The heavy snows melted, revealing tender green shoots pushing up through the earth. The cattle gave birth to healthy calves, and the two milk cows presented them with one calf each, ensuring a continued supply of milk and butter. Grace and Kade fell into a new rhythm as true partners. They still maintained separate rooms for propriety's sake when visitors came, but each night Kade would come to her, or she to him, their physical relationship deepening alongside their growing emotional connection. Emma blossomed in the freedom of ranch life. She followed Kade everywhere, learning about the animals and soaking up his patient explanations of ranch work. To Grace's delight, he began teaching the child to ride on a gentle pony he'd acquired specifically for her. "She's a natural," he told Grace proudly after Emma's first successful solo ride around the corral. "Got a good seat and no fear." "Just like her father," Grace said, the words slipping out naturally. Kade's eyes widened momentarily before a slow smile spread across his face. It was the first time Grace had referred to him as Emma's father without qualification, and the significance wasn't lost on either of them. That evening, after Emma was in bed, Kade found Grace on the porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of orange and purple. He sat beside her on the bench, taking her hand in his. "I've been thinking," he said, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "The ranch is doing well, better than I expected for our first year. I think we should ride into town next week, do some trading, maybe buy some fabric for new curtains like you've been wanting." "That would be wonderful," Grace agreed. "Emma has outgrown most of her clothes, too," Kade nodded. "There's something else." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch. "I had this made the last time I was in town, but I was waiting for the right moment." He emptied the pouch into his palm, revealing a gold ring set with a small but brilliant diamond. "When we married, it was an arrangement," he said, his voice low and earnest. "But it's become so much more than that, at least for me." Grace felt tears welling in her eyes as Kade continued. "I love you, Grace Sullivan." I love your strength and your kindness, your laughter and even your stubbornness. I love watching you with Emma and seeing the way you've made this house into a home." He held up the ring. "I want to give you this not as part of any bargain, but as a token of my love and a promise that I'll spend every day trying to be worthy of yours." "Oh, Cade," Grace whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I love you too, so much." He slid the ring onto her finger, where it nestled against her wedding band. Then he gathered her into his arms, his kiss conveying all the emotion words couldn't express. When they finally separated, Grace rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I have something to tell you as well," she said softly. "What's that?" She looked up at him, joy making her eyes shine even in the gathering dusk. "I believe we'll need to prepare the small bedroom next to ours. In about 7 months, Emma will have a brother or sister." The expression that crossed Cade's face was one Grace knew she would remember for the rest of her life, a mixture of shock, joy, and overwhelming love that transformed his features. "A baby," he whispered, his hand moving to rest gently on her still flat stomach. "Our baby." Grace nodded, covering his hand with hers. "Our baby." Cade let out a whoop of joy that startled the horses in the nearby corral, then lifted Grace from the bench and spun her around, making her laugh even as she protested. "Be careful, I'm in a delicate condition." He set her down immediately, his expression comically contrite. "I'm sorry, did I hurt you?" "Is the baby? We're fine," she assured him, smiling at his concern. "Just fine." Cade pulled her close again, more gently this time. "Thank you," he murmured against her hair. "For Emma. For our little one on the way. For making my life complete when I didn't even know how empty it was." "I should be thanking you," Grace replied, thinking back to that desperate night at the Golden Palace Saloon. "You saved me, Cade. In every way a person can be saved." He shook his head. "No, my love. We saved each other." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky above Sullivan Ranch, Grace knew it was true. From the unlikeliest of beginnings, a desperate widow and a lonesome cowboy making a practical arrangement had grown something beautiful and enduring. A family bound together by love, respect, and the promise of a future brighter than either could have imagined alone. November arrived with a dusting of early snow and the cries of a healthy baby boy. Cade paced the hallway outside their bedroom as Mrs. Redmond assisted Grace through a difficult but ultimately successful delivery. When at last he was allowed inside, the sight that greeted him brought tears to his eyes. Grace, exhausted but radiant, holding a small bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. "Come meet your son," she said, her voice tired but filled with joy. Cade approached the bed with almost reverent steps. When Grace placed the infant in his arms, he stared down at the tiny red face in wonder. "He's perfect," he whispered, counting 10 tiny fingers and toes. "What shall we name him?" Grace asked, watching the tender expression on her husband's face. Cade considered for a moment. "Thomas," he said finally. "Thomas Sullivan, after the man who gave Emma life and loved you first." Fresh tears filled Grace's eyes at his thoughtfulness. "Thomas Kade Sullivan," she amended. "So he carries both men who have blessed my life." Emma was brought in to meet her new brother, her blue eyes wide with curiosity and importance. At 5 years old, she took her role as big sister very seriously, solemnly promising to help teach the baby everything she knew about horses and cattle. Life settled into a new pattern with the baby's arrival. Grace devoted herself to caring for young Thomas while continuing to manage the household. Cade took on more responsibility with Emma, teaching her to read and write in the evenings by the fire when the day's work was done. The ranch prospered under their joint care. Cade's initial herd of 20 cattle had grown to nearly 80, and they'd added sheep, more horses, and a flock of chickens that kept them well supplied with eggs. The vegetable garden Grace had planted in the spring had yielded abundantly, and their root cellar was full for the coming winter. One crisp December evening, as Christmas approached once more, Kade returned from checking on a pregnant mare to find Grace sitting in the rocking chair by the fire, Thomas sleeping in her arms. Emma lay on a blanket nearby, carefully drawing pictures of horses with the colored pencils Kade had bought her on their last trip to town. The scene struck him with such a powerful sense of rightness that he stood in the doorway for a long moment, simply watching his family, yes, his family in the warm glow of the firelight. Grace looked up, smiling when she saw him. "Everything all right with Daisy?" "Fine," he replied, moving to her side and dropping a kiss on her upturned face. "She's not ready yet, but it won't be long." He took the sleeping baby from her arms, cradling his son with a confidence that had grown over the past month. Thomas made a small sound of contentment and nestled closer to his father's chest. "I have something for you," Kade said, reaching into his pocket with his free hand. He withdrew a folded document and handed it to Grace. She opened it curiously, then looked up at him in surprise. "The deed to the ranch, but it's already in both our names." "Look at the name," he said, nodding toward the paper. Grace looked down again, reading aloud, "Sullivan Family Ranch." She glanced up, eyes questioning. Kade sat on the arm of her chair, balancing the baby carefully. "When I bought this place, it was for me. Then it became for us, you, me, and Emma. Now it's Thomas's future too, and any other children we might be blessed with." He touched the paper gently. "I wanted the name to reflect what this land truly is, the foundation of our family." Grace leaned her head against his side, overwhelmed by the gesture and all it represented. "It's perfect," she said softly. Emma abandoned her drawing to join them, climbing onto Grace's lap and reaching out to touch her brother's tiny hand. "We're a family," she declared with a child's simple certainty. "Yes, we are, sweetheart," Kade agreed, his arm extending to encompass all of them. As they sat together in the warm parlor, with snow beginning to fall gently outside the window, Grace reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the depths of despair in a saloon in Willits to the height of happiness on their ranch, it seemed almost like a dream. Yet it was real as the solid weight of Emma on her lap, as real as the baby in Kade's arms, as real as the love that had grown between a desperate widow and the cowboy who had offered her not just his name, but his heart. Grace looked up at her husband, finding his eyes already on her, filled with a love that still took her breath away. "Thank you," she whispered. Kade's smile deepened, the lines around his eyes crinkling in the way she had come to adore. "For what? For finding me. For bringing us here. For giving us this life." He leaned down to kiss her, a gentle promise of all the years to come. "Always, my love. Always." Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing Sullivan Family Ranch in a pristine white cover that sparkled in the moonlight. Inside, a family born of necessity but bound by love looked forward to Christmas and all the seasons that would follow, secure in the knowledge that they had found in each other everything they would ever need. 10 years later, Grace stood on the porch of the ranch house, watching as Kade demonstrated roping techniques to their sons. Thomas, now 10, mirrored his father's movements with the concentration typical of his serious nature. 7-year-old James attempted the same with more enthusiasm than skill, his rope frequently tangling around his own boots. 5-year-old Michael, not to be outdone by his brothers, swung a small rope in wild circles, narrowly missing the family dog who wisely retreated to the safety of the porch steps. Emma, 15 and blossoming into a beautiful young woman, sat beside Grace, working on a piece of embroidery for the county fair. She had her mother's auburn hair and her father's blue eyes, though Grace still thought of her as having Thomas Nelson's eyes whenever she was being particularly stubborn. "Papa's patient with the boys," Emma observed, looking up from her needlework. "I remember when he was teaching me to rope." "I was terrible," Grace laughed. "You were 7, and you learned faster than any of your brothers." "That's because girls pay attention," Emma replied with the wisdom of adolescence. "Boys just want to show off." As if to prove her point, James attempted a dramatic flourish with his rope that sent him tumbling into the dirt. Kade helped him up with a few encouraging words that soon had the boy trying again. "Your father has always been a good teacher," Grace said, watching her husband with the same admiration she'd felt for 10 years. Time had added a few threads of silver to his dark hair and deepened the lines around his eyes, but to Grace, he was more handsome than ever, his face now carrying the stories of their shared life. The ranch had prospered beyond their early hopes. Sullivan Family Ranch was now one of the most respected cattle operations in the county, employing several hands year-round and more during the busy seasons. The original house had been expanded to accommodate their growing family, and a schoolhouse had been built halfway between their property and the Redmond place, allowing the children from both families and neighboring ranches to receive an education without the long journey to town. Grace herself had become the teacher, drawing on her earlier experience to provide the children with a solid foundation in reading, writing, mathematics, and history. Kade had built her a fine desk from oak, and every child who entered the schoolhouse benefited from both her knowledge and the love of learning she instilled in them. Mrs. Redmond still visited regularly, though she moved a bit slower these days. Her son Daniel had married a sweet girl from town, and they had 2 children of their own who attended Grace's school. The community that had formed around the ranch felt like an extended family, coming together for barn raisings, harvests, and celebrations. "Ma," Michael called, running up the porch steps. "Look what I can do." He demonstrated his version of a rope trick, which mostly involved spinning in circles until he collapsed in a giggling heap at Grace's feet. "Very impressive," she assured him, ruffling his blonde curls. "You'll be a champion roper in no time." Satisfied with her praise, he raced back to his brothers, eager to show them his trick as well. "Were you thinking about how you met Papa?" Emma asked suddenly, her perceptive eyes studying her mother's face. "You get a certain look when you remember those days." Grace smiled, sometimes forgetting how observant her daughter had become. They had never hidden the circumstances of their marriage from Emma, believing that honesty was important. As she grew older, they had shared more details, helping her understand that sometimes the most beautiful beginnings could arise from the most difficult circumstances. "I was," Grace admitted, "thinking about how close I came to a very different life and how your father changed everything." Emma set aside her embroidery. "Do you ever regret it, marrying someone you barely knew?" Grace considered the question seriously, knowing her daughter deserved a thoughtful answer. "No," she said finally. "I was terrified at the time, but I knew your father was a good man from the moment he helped us at the saloon. The love came later, but the respect was there from the beginning." She smiled at her daughter. "Sometimes life doesn't give you the luxury of a long courtship. Sometimes you have to trust your instincts and take a leap of faith." "Like you did with Papa," Emma said. "Yes," Grace agreed, watching as Kade successfully taught James a simpler rope technique that had the boy beaming with pride. "And it turned out to be the best decision I ever made." The dinner bell rang, signaling that Rosa, the Mexican woman who helped with cooking and housework, had the evening meal ready. The boys dropped their ropes immediately, racing toward the house with the single-minded focus of hungry children. Kade gathered the abandoned equipment before following at a more measured pace. As he climbed the porch steps, his eyes met Grace's with the same warmth that never failed to make her heart beat faster. After 15 years of marriage, for they counted from the day he'd found her in Willits, not from their wedding ceremony, the connection between them had only deepened. "Successful lessons?" Grace asked as he leaned down to kiss her. "They're coming along," Kade replied with the pride of a father. "Thomas has a natural talent. James just needs to slow down and think before he acts, and Michael will do things his own way or not at all," Grace finished with a laugh. "Just like his father," Kade grinned, not bothering to deny the comparison. "Stubborn as a mule, that one." "I prefer to think of it as determined," Grace said, rising to her feet. "Come on, let's eat before the boys devour everything Rosa's prepared." Emma went ahead of them, but Kade held Grace back for a moment, his hand warm on her arm. "I was thinking," he said, his voice low and intimate, "that we might ride out to the North Ridge tomorrow, just the two of us. Daniel can watch the boys and Emma's old enough to help." Grace raised an eyebrow. "The North Ridge, where we had that picnic last spring." A mischievous glint appeared in Kade's eyes. "The very same. I seem to recall we found a particularly private spot with a fine view." Heat rose in Grace's cheeks at the memory. After more than a decade of marriage and 4 children, Kade still had the ability to make her blush like a girl. "Mr. Sullivan," she said with mock severity, "are you suggesting we abandon our responsibilities for an afternoon of scenery appreciation?" He pulled her closer, his arms encircling her waist. "Among other appreciations," he murmured against her ear. "I find myself particularly appreciative of my wife these days." Grace laughed, the sound full of happiness. "Well then, I suppose we could arrange an expedition to the North Ridge, for scientific observation purposes, of course." "Of course," Kade agreed solemnly, though his eyes danced with anticipation. From inside the house came the sounds of their family children's voices raised in conversation, the clatter of plates, Rosa's melodious admonition for the boys to wash their hands. The life they had built together thrummed with vitality and love. "We should go in," Grace said, though she made no move to leave the circle of his arms. Kade nodded but held her for one moment more. "Do you know what day it is?" he asked quietly. Grace thought for a moment, then understood. "December 12th. The day you found me at the Golden Palace. The day my real life began," he corrected, his hand coming up to touch her face with a gentleness that still moved her. "I thank God every day for leading me to that saloon at that exact moment." "As do I," Grace whispered, leaning into his touch. "As do I." Their kiss was interrupted by Thomas calling from the doorway, "Ma, Pa, the food's getting cold and Michael's trying to take all the biscuits." They broke apart, laughing, and went inside to join their family. As Grace took her place at the table, surveying the happy chaos of their household, Kade at the head of the table, their sons jostling for position, Emma helping Rosa serve the stew, the dogs hoping for scraps beneath the table, she felt the same wave of gratitude that washed over her every day. From desperation to joy, from loneliness to family, from arrangement to love, their journey had not always been easy, but every step had led them here, to this moment of simple, profound happiness. And for that, Grace Sullivan would be forever thankful to the cowboy who had seen beyond her circumstances to the woman she truly was, and offered not just his name, but his heart and his life. As Kade caught her eye across the table and winked, Grace knew with absolute certainty that their story, improbable as it had once seemed, had found exactly the ending it deserved.